1804, pagan all. In the days of 1804, pagan all. In the days of 1804, I said I'd peg those shoes no more. Throw away my pegs, my pegs, my pegs, my all. They've invented a new machine, pagan all. They've invented a new machine, pagan all. They've invented a new machine, prettiest little thing you ever seen. Throw away my pegs, my pegs, my pegs, my all. Makes 100 pairs to my one peg and all. Makes 100 pairs to my one peg and all. Makes 100 pairs to my one peggin' shoes, it ain't no fun. Throw away my pegs, my pegs, my pegs, my pegs, my all.
Welcome back. That is the great Pete Seeger, American folk singer, with an American folk song from the 19th century, Peg and All, about the unfortunate, from the point of view of the worker, transition from making things by hand to making things with the help of machinery, which of course was much more efficient, which meant people could buy a lot more stuff. It would usher in, over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, a new era of mass consumerism, but it also displaced a lot of worker and took skill out of the equation. We talked last time about the transportation revolution, and we talked about some of the ramifications of that, including the creation of an integrated national market. And another part of the increasingly modern American economy that had been envisioned by Alexander Hamilton and had been promoted by Henry Clay and others, and had been pursued in real life by entrepreneurs and Governor DeWitt Clinton in New York and innovators like Fulton and the Supreme Court and their interventions in promoting a more comfortable constitutional and legal framework for corporations. Well, all of that is part of the story. And another part of the same story is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is connected to where we left off last time with the market revolution. It wasn't just, as we saw last time, that you could now safely pursue incorporation, or that you could now efficiently travel from Albany to Buffalo and everywhere radiating outward from those two cities. It was also that this market revolution meant that people were more connected and they could consume, and it wasn't just grain that they were consuming. They were also increasingly consuming more and more manufactured goods. And since you could grow things more efficiently out in the West, and now you could connect those Western cereals to Eastern urban markets, you could actually have cities, right? If you have cities and you don't have them connected to farms, then everybody's going to starve. Obviously, the countryside of Pennsylvania, New York, New England had produced plenty of grain throughout most of American history. Indeed, all of those places, including New York, were majority agricultural beyond the framework of this class, well past the Civil War. All of those places were still majority farms. And yet the scale of the Western granary would allow for the scale of Eastern urbanization and industrialization, along with a lot of other things. And so the market revolution has even more parts to it, and one of those parts is the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution had been underway in Britain for some time, since back in the 1700s. In Britain, textile manufacturers, the ones, right, textiles is the making of cotton cloth, or there's also woolen textiles, but in any case, textile manufacturers like the ones you see in the background of this 19th century painting of Manchester, England, they concentrated in the British Industrial Revolution more and more production within the walls of larger and larger factories. And they divided labor processes up rationally, and they mechanized production, which is to say they added machines that could do tasks more efficiently. And they broke things down into smaller and smaller tasks. And so they took skill out of the equation, which meant you could hire practically anybody to work in these places, and you could pay them very little. And if they complained, since they're quote unquote unskilled workers, you just replace them with someone else. The British economy boomed in part as a result of this, and they jealously and wisely guarded the technological secrets behind their industrial progress. Still, it was only a matter of time before this would spread elsewhere. The United States was working toward industrialization at a creeping pace, as you already know, in the 1790s. It got more rapid in the 1810s for a number of reasons. Part of it was the fact that during the War of 1812, President Madison, it suddenly dawned on him that if the nation was too reliant on foreign trade and there was a national emergency, we might get cut off. And so during the war, both James and Dolly Madison had encouraged people to make their own products and to buy American. And after the war, as you know, they passed the 25% on average tariff to promote national industries. But even more important than that was piracy. And I don't mean on the high seas. I mean basically stealing British designs. Samuel Slater had worked under the British inventor Richard Arkwright, who Arkwright was the creator of many of the most sophisticated cotton spinning machines in the British arsenal. Britain was going to remain the dominant industrial force for some time, but in the meantime, Slater was basically a sort of patriotic pirate. He wasn't allowed to take drawing materials into the factories with him because they were afraid he'd try to sneak out blueprints of their factories, and yet he had a good mind and he memorized what things looked like. He went back to his home where he was staying, and he made bootleg drawings of the machinery, brought it back to the United States, reproduced the technology, introduced it into a failing cotton mill near Providence, Rhode Island. And that failing mill was suddenly quite profitable because of this innovation, and so others copied this success. And so mechanization, using machinery to produce more efficiently in the manufacturing process, was key to the sudden rapid industrialization of New England. And it's in New England for another reason, and that is a cheap source of power, because there are a lot of rivers running downhill to the ocean across New England, and water going downhill. That's gravity, and you put a wheel next to that, and it turns the wheel, and the wheel powers your machinery. And there was a large pool of potential cheap workers in New England. Because, as you know, New England has rocky soil and was running out of space for families, and so you could have lots of farms across New England, but you couldn't sustain an ever-increasing farm population. And so what do you do with the extra children? And one answer is they go and work in the factories to make some money for the family. And so the manufacturing process had come to the United States textile industry across New England. In 1814, Francis Cabot Lowell and two other investors formed the Boston Manufacturing Company with $400,000 in investments and with an incorporation, which we've already talked about the value of that. They constructed an immense factory at Waltham, Massachusetts, which was the first factory in the United States that performed all of the tasks involved in making cotton cloth in the same building. The Waltham investors understood that they could make even better profits with their factory system if they built on a stronger current. And the Merrimack River drops 30 feet at the site where present-day Lowell, Massachusetts is situated. Now, there was no Lowell, Massachusetts at the time. They realized, however, that the river falls downhill dramatically there, and it has a strong current. And so Mr. Lowell and his partners built a factory. It eventually would become the city of Lowell, Massachusetts. It became a city because the investors needed workers, and so they brought more and more people to their factory to live near it and to work in it. And all of this made everything more cost effective since everything's concentrated under one roof, and then eventually it is a network of buildings and so forth. But it starts as one factory. Well, the best way to recruit cheap labor was to look for the daughters of New England farm families to come and work in the factories. The boys, as you know, going back to the beginning of the class, up to a very early age, were needed in the fields. And children in general were living, and that's a very good thing, but it means you have more hands than you need now on the farm, especially in a society that valued male labor on the farm, especially girls. And so farmers' daughters seemed like the perfect labor pool in New England, which seemed to have an excess of farm population, generally speaking. And so the Boston Manufacturing Company recruited these farmers' daughters, and they become known as the Lowell girls. And that's not being sexist. They really are girls. They're not adult women for the most part. They constructed dormitories for these girls to live in, and essentially they had absolute control, at least in the early years, over their day-to-day lives. There were chaperones in the dormitories. There were strict curfews. There were all sorts of rules and regulations about their behavior. Rules against immoral conduct, as defined by the company. Rules against drinking. Rules that obliged you to attend church services, and so forth. You may ask, what is the point of all of these sort of heavy-handed interventions into the day-to-day lives of your workers? After all, these are not your children. So why are you invoking this attitude of in loco parentis? I'm the new parent because your parents are not here at the dorms. It might seem like a bit much, but remember a couple of things. Number one, New England's Puritan tradition, which is still very strong in that culture at this time. And I would also suggest that if you're going to convince these Congregationalist Protestant farm families who are used to a traditional family-centered, church-centered way of life to send their daughters off to this industrial operation, which is increasingly an urban setting, to live in a dorm away from the family, you want to put the minds of the parents at ease. Partly, of course, it's very convenient to micromanage the lives of your workers and to control their lives and to dominate their lives, because that allows you to dominate their labor and their wages and everything else. But part of it is also a very useful way of convincing New England families that this is safe, that this is pure, that this is moral. And so both of those things mattered to the company. The centralization of production along with residential employees became known first as the Waltham system and over time as the Lowell system. There were 40,000 New England women and girls working in textile mills by the early 1830s, so it grew very fast. They were usually very young women. They usually sent their wages back to the family farm. Often the fathers controlled the wages, both legally and sort of culturally within the family. Many of the women and girls did try to save up as much as they could so they could afford to leave the factory and get married. And others just spent the money on themselves week to week, as some people want to do. It's important to note that among these Lowell girls, all of these shared experiences, both their work experience and their shared experience in the dorms, in their living quarters. For some companies, and it's not just the Lowell factory, and that's the point, these factories proliferate. And so in Lowell, there are a bunch of different companies. And in Lawrence, Massachusetts, there are a bunch of different companies. And then later on in southeastern Massachusetts, in New Bedford and in Fall River, and in Rhode Island, there are entire little mill towns where they recruit these workers. All around the Blackstone River Valley, the Patuxent River Valley, the Merrimack Valley, the Connecticut River Valley, you get these operations, and about 75% of the workers lived in company housing at this time. And in the smaller towns, the company controlled the entire town. They owned the housing or the dormitories. They rang bells to clear the streets at night and to get people awake in the morning. I've told you they had all these different rules in the dorms, but even as things moved on, they still had control over life. Well, that does, on the one hand, give a lot of power to the company, but it also at times gives power to the workers insofar as these shared experiences, both in the factory and in the dormitory, gave them opportunities for socialization. And they were able to build social bonds that led to greater solidarity and at times could even allow for unified action among these workers. In the meantime, another fundamental alteration to the way Americans worked in this period was an increasing division of labor. As I said, part of industrialization is mechanization. Part of it is putting everything under one roof. But another part of that is breaking down a skill into a series of minor steps that virtually anyone can be trained to do. And those unskilled tasks then, as I've already said, you don't have to pay people very much, especially when you replace people with machines. But even if you don't, a wonderful example is shoemaking, which had been the province of skilled craftsmen until the early 19th century, and which inspired the shift in it, inspired the song that I started the lecture with today. The shoemaker's workshop was usually, for centuries, part of their home. And a master craftsman would work in that, what was called the 10-footer, which was approximately the size of their workshop. They would work at shoemaking. Every single piece of the process was done by this skilled craftsman. And they would bring in a journeyman shoemaker who was aspiring to become a master craftsman and learn the skills. And these people would actually live in the master's household. The craftsman was also a salesman, and so he was dependent on his reputation in town for skill, for being fair with his prices, and so forth. This is a very medieval sounding system. It's very old-fashioned, and it revolves around one's talent, one's ingenuity, and one's reputation. And this allows for a certain degree of independence. Again, Jefferson had been afraid of industrialization because it made some people the boss and a lot of other people not independent. They were workers. They worked for somebody else. But this guy, nobody is his boss. He's his own boss. And so he's just as independent as a yeoman farmer, this shoemaker. And that whole system got blown apart with industrialization. Capitalists sought a more efficient and therefore more profitable means of producing shoes among other consumer items. And so work was divided up. It's no longer this one skilled process. Instead, you divide it into a bunch of small tasks, and you get a bunch of, at first, semi-skilled workers, usually from the journeyman class, to cut the leather. This was then sent out to farm women, farmers' wives, who would sew linings into the shoe pieces, often in their homes for very little pay. And then it was sent to a workshop where it would be assembled, the pieces would be put together by other craftsmen. Skill was therefore systematically taken out of the equation, and that meant the workers became increasingly interchangeable, increasingly replaceable, much less expensive. And eventually there was enough investment to get rid of the outwork portion of this, where you're sending it out, and actually bring those usually very poorly paid women into the factory itself. And a big part of that is also technological innovation, because once you get sewing machines, which become widely available for this and other industries in the 1850s, once you get that, then you can bring all these people into a single factory and you can mass produce shoes. It had some very important effects. On the one hand, it meant that the average person didn't just own one pair of shoes their whole life, and they'd have to go to the cobbler, go back to the shoemaker in order to get them fixed anytime there was a problem. It meant now you could afford multiple pairs of shoes. And so this, in theory, is a benefit to consumers in a modernizing capitalist economy. But on the other hand, what it meant was workers were de-skilled and replaceable and were paid a lot less. And it also had social consequences. Because as I said, the independent craftsman could fancy himself as a good Republican citizen, just as independent as any yeoman farmer. And so there's something very Jeffersonian about the political perspective of a master craftsman shoemaker or metalworker, a smith, or the pewterers, whose political and fraternal banner you can see pictured here, right? It is a symbol of the fact that their skill makes them independent, and their independence makes them good Republican citizens who are wise voters and so forth. And that is slipping away when you have de-skilling and mechanization and industrialization and so forth. There's something incredibly undemocratic about having a boss, especially when you used to be the boss, but even if you never were. The very word boss, in fact, was also an adaptation of this period, believe it or not, because people didn't like having the relationship between the management and the laborer. They didn't like it being referred to as master and servant the way it always was up until this point, and so they adopted the word boss from the Dutch language because it felt a little bit less undemocratic. But perhaps master and servant was more appropriate because workers no longer controlled their own labor. They no longer worked at their own pace. They no longer made their own rules. There is no longer intellectual engagement with their product. There's no longer creativity. It was a jarring transition. If you want a sense for how important craft was to the self-identity and the self-respect of a lot of these workers, just think about last names. There are various categories of last names in English and in a lot of other languages as well. A lot of last names which average people were only starting to be given the dignity of a last name maybe in the Renaissance, in the late Middle Ages. Well, where do they get these names, these family names from? It could be from your father, right? Any last name that ends in son, for example, tends to be son of, whatever. Or it could be named after a town or a physical description, colors, size, small or white or brown or green or whatever. And another one would be your job, your craft. Think about all of the last names that you can just rattle off, the common ones, and so many of them are based on some sort of craft. It doesn't mean everybody with that name did that craft. It doesn't mean everybody named Tanner tans hides for leather, or that everyone named Cooper builds barrels. But the point is that at some point in that family's development, somebody had thought highly enough of the place of that skill set in their day-to-day existence that they made it part of their family's identity. And even if those specific families might have moved on over the years, it doesn't mean that the people who were still coopers or smiths or cobblers or whatever, it doesn't mean that for them this was not a terrible transition and a loss of a piece of themselves. Now, sometimes they fought back. When skilled workers, who were now wage workers in the building trades, construction, carpenters, masons, people like that, when they became fed up with management trying to make them work longer in the summer because there's more sunlight and so you can work longer for the same pay, well, those people went out on strike. For example, in Philadelphia in the 1830s, they were able to gain a 10-hour day. That was rare, though. Usually the workers lost. In 1834, bosses at the Lowell mills tried to cut wages by 15%, and the Lowell girls went out on strike. Now, they made a strategic move. They also withdrew their money from the company-owned bank, which caused a run on the bank in the town and a minor panic in the local economy. That bought them some time, but ultimately their strike failed. But the fact that they were able to do that was because they coordinated their efforts, partly because they lived together with this common experience and they worked together with that shared experience, and so they were able to build solidarity. And even though they lost in that instance, they were able to coordinate their action, which for them is potentially a good sign. Indeed, a second strike in Lowell went differently because it wasn't over wages that time, it was over rent. The manufacturers tried to raise the rent on the Lowell girls in 1836, and they went out on strike again, and they gained support from the broader Lowell community. By this time, Lowell had grown from a factory with some dorms around it into a city, and since rent was going up around the city, they got support from the community, and the strike worked, and rent was kept where it had been. Through the 1830s and 40s, the Lowell women remained assertive, and they grew increasingly assertive, partly because of these strike experiences, which built that notion of solidarity I talked about, and they even began lobbying the Massachusetts legislature to try and get them to regulate their working hours. Now, of course, that was going to take a long time, but it was the start. The largest strike of all occurred at the very end of the time period we are going to be studying together this semester, and that was going to be in Lynn, Massachusetts, a major shoemaking hub, the major shoemaking hub at that time, a shoemaker's strike in 1860. Now, by 1850, the factory system being established at Lynn was incredibly productive. They were producing 4.5 million shoes every year, but that efficiency meant that they were able to produce so many shoes that eventually they overproduced. There was a glut in the market of shoes by 1857, and in general, in 1857 and in the late 1850s, there was an economic depression that we'll talk about later. Well, what this meant was demand decreased and they had too much supply, and so the factories tried to cut wages in order to save money. And the workers started to organize to keep their wages up, beginning in 1858. And by February of 1860, they had had enough of the wage cuts, and they went out on strike. Eventually, 20,000 shoe workers in 25 different New England cities and towns joined the strike. Many of them were women who had been brought into the factory system en masse after sewing machines were introduced in 1852. Before that, of course, as I told you already, they'd sent out the pieces to farm women, but now they were bringing the women into the factories with the sewing machines. Well, thousands of women strikers marched through a terrible blizzard in March of 1860. The strike was gaining momentum. Thousands of people, women and men, were participating. It was so popular that at one point the city of Lynn had to call in for help from militia and police assistance from Boston. However, something happened. There was a reason that the managers always wanted women to work in these factories, and better yet, girls and children. And the answer to that question, which probably won't surprise you, was patriarchy and sexism. This idea that the male is the breadwinner in the household, and therefore women's wages are somehow extra. And therefore it is acceptable and indeed appropriate to pay women far less than men, and children too. And so they wanted these women and children in the factories because, based on the sexism of that time, they could get away with pushing them around even more than the men, whom they also pushed around, but also because it was considered socially appropriate to pay the women less and the children less. And the problem is the men in the factories felt that way too. And so when they went on strike, what happened was, at first the women and the men were working together and you had solidarity. But then the women found out that the men were negotiating on the side to raise their wages and to let the women get the wage cut. Well, the women said, fine, you're on your own, and they went back to work, and the strike collapsed in April of 1860. The point is, there's a couple of things. Number one, solidarity is difficult to build among the workers because of diversity and because of the fact that people often viewed themselves not based on their status as workers, who were all being increasingly taken advantage of by this system, but they saw themselves instead as men, or as native born, as we'll see in a moment when immigrants start to arrive, or by other demographic factors. And of course those things mattered, but if they overshadow the fact that you're all workers and you're all facing a wage cut, then you're not going to be able to get much done as far as solidarity in some sort of labor movement. In the meantime, something else is important to understand. It's not as though all of these thousands of striking shoemakers in 1860 were displaced craftsmen. Most of them were unskilled laborers, the cheap laborers who had been brought in. One source, as I've already said, was women, and children were another. But even less expensive, because they're even more desperate, was immigrants. Lowell began replacing the Lowell girls with Irish families, especially in the 1840s, as more and more Irish refugees from a horrible famine there were arriving in the country. And we'll talk more about that later, because it's going to complicate things on many levels in this country with this first wave of mass immigration. And so the Irish, by 1850, already 1/3 of the workers in many factories in New England were Irish immigrants. And you also had increasing numbers of immigrants coming in from Quebec in French Canada, where you had a surging population, but a very short growing season on their farms. And again, rocky soil and a cold climate, and so the land could not sustain the peasants in French Canada, and so a lot of French Canadians began coming down to these factories to work as well. The city of Woonsocket, Rhode Island, for example, is one of many examples of industrial cities that in the 19th century becomes overwhelmingly French Canadian. So in different places it's different groups, but these are some of the earlier ones. Later on, Germans will show up, but they're a different story. But the major immigrant group right now, the first big one, is the Irish. And they were very desperate, and that meant that they were cheap, and so that meant management was very eager to replace their increasingly assertive native-born women with immigrants. They could pay the immigrants even less. They were even more desperate. A Lowell girl, if things got really bad, could often go home to the farm. The immigrants have nowhere to go. The Quebecois maybe, but the Irish certainly not. And they were increasingly desperate, and we'll hear more about them later on. These two powerful forces, in the meantime, industrialization and immigration, were going to lead to another important evolution in American demography, and that is the growth of cities in these years. Large factories concentrate population. They concentrate a lot of people in one place. All those farmers leaving the countryside to work in cities, the arrival of immigrants who are going to also work in those cities, they're all getting concentrated around those factories. And cities grow, cities are created as a result of this. In 1790, the time of the first United States Census, only 5% of the United States population lived in urban areas, but by 1850, it was over 14%. Now, to us, that's very, very low, but it had tripled essentially in a little over half a century, and so that's a dramatic shift. We'll talk later on about great cities like Philadelphia and New York and Brooklyn and Baltimore and Boston that were growing dramatically at this time, but these medium-sized cities were also growing dramatically because of industrialization. The port cities, they have diverse reasons for their growth, but cities that had been little more than towns when manufacturing arrived suddenly grew spectacularly. Lynn, Massachusetts had a population of 2,837 in 1800, 4,515 in 1820. By 1850, it was up to more than 14,000 people. And Lowell was founded specifically for Mr. Lowell's textile operations. There hadn't been a Lowell before that factory was built. It was incorporated as a city in 1826, and in 1830, the population was already about 6,400, which for that time is a small factory city. But a decade later, it was already over 20,000. By 1850, there were 33,000 people living in Lowell. And that's, at that time, a city. Today, it doesn't sound impressive to you, but that's a city. In the cities, as in the workplaces, a lot of people were being brought together in an entirely new dynamic. And that would lead to all sorts of controversies that we'll talk about later in the class. But it was also the setting for the workers, and by this I especially mean the so-called unskilled workers, to start the very first whispers of developing a sense of class. It can be difficult to identify expressions of class consciousness among the industrial workers of the antebellum period. It's much more obvious with the craftsmen because they always had their identity wrapped up in their class as skilled workers. But as I said a moment ago, the thousands of workers who were going on strike in Lynn, or the Lowell girls who were going on strike from time to time, or any number of other smaller episodes of labor unrest in these years, these movements were not comprised wholly or even mostly of master craftsmen. They were the desperate refugees from Ireland or from Quebec or from other places, England, Scotland. Or they were young men and women from the United States who had left farm life to try and make some money in the cities. Most of these people were unskilled. Almost all of them were poorly paid, poorly treated, working grueling marathon shifts at least 6 days a week. These people weren't fighting against a change in their relationship to work because they were new to this world. They weren't even fighting per se against the wage system. They were fighting against the fact that because management recognized they were replaceable, management was trying to take advantage of them and pay them as little as possible. They didn't appreciate, in a democratic republic, being forced to go along with the whims of management. And so, even though it's only the beginning of the idea of sort of class consciousness and a working class in America, they start in these years perhaps improvisational. They start to develop an answer to Jefferson's concern about industrialization putting some people above everyone else. And their answer is, if they can join together, perhaps they can fight back collectively and balance things out and make things more democratic. Now, the reality, as you know, is they're not going to succeed at all in these years. And they're not going to succeed for the most part in the years after this class ends either. In the years after the Civil War, when industrialization gets even more robust in this country and you have heavy industry, you'll see major strikes in the railroads or in steel or in the mines, and they will almost always fail. They will almost always be put down by local or state or national government, as well as hired goons, and they will often be replaced by even newer, even more desperate immigrant labor. And they will often get distracted by attacking the immigrants rather than attacking their bosses. You will see some success for the working class organizing and trying to get better treatment in the late 1930s and in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, but you're going to have to wait a while for this to really pan out. And even then, it's a mixed story. But this is the beginning of that story, and we introduce it today. As you can see, of course, there were political ramifications to all of this. Remember, backing up to the previous lecture, that a key to Henry Clay's American system was New England manufacturing. And as you had the growth of manufacturing, you had a class of people whose livelihood was dependent on the factories. And, as we'll see next time, you increasingly had universal suffrage for white men, which meant even these poor people, even these poor men, could vote, which meant suddenly there was a class or at least a craft or industrial interest in politics. There was an economic interest in politics for the working class. And as you can see in this campaign propaganda, Henry Clay appealed to the workers in the factory, saying you should vote for me and not for General Jackson, for example, because our American system will protect your job. And so it changes politics as well. And there was a cultural element. As I've told you, the change in the nature of work, the change in the workers' relationship to their product, to their craft, to their lack of a craft, the change in self-identity, all of these things transformed over time American culture, American economics, American politics, American demography, American self-identity. It was, as I've suggested, only the very beginning. But it was the beginning of a major change in American life that was only going to get even more complicated, even more raucous, even more rambunctious and energetic, and at times, for these, at least for the white men involved here, even more democratic as time went on. And that democracy, as more and more people got in, and as more and more people were basing their opinions and their politics on group identity, that politics wasn't even only going to get more democratic, it was also potentially going to get more demagogic, which is a nice preview for the age of Andrew Jackson, where we pick up our story next time.